Hello everyone, I'm Olivia Woolley, University of Aberdeen, School of Law, and in my presentation I'll be telling you about the role of law in delivering on the wise use obligation in the Ramsar Convention. I'm afraid my presentation's short on pictures. There's no pictures of anybody getting into a bog or of wildlife, but that's law for you. Not always very exciting, but unless you're a legal researcher, in which case it's often thrilling. But otherwise absolutely essential, and as we'll see, it's essential to have good national legal frameworks to properly implement the Ramsar Convention. So what are we going to be covering in the presentation? Well, we'll start off by looking at what the wise use obligation actually requires, thinking about law's role in achieving that obligation. Then we'll turn to some difficulties that the one aspect of the wise use obligation, the need to maintain ecological character, presents for our existing legal approaches to protecting the environment, and looking at what alternative legal approaches might be required to those that we currently employ to enable wetlands and indeed other ecosystems to be used wisely. And finally, we'll be returning to the Ramsar Convention, looking at what the fourth strategic plan that's going to be considered at the forthcoming conference of the parties, what that has to say about legal frameworks. So, wise use under the Ramsar Convention, what does it require? Well, Article 3.1 is the operative provision. Contracting parties required to formulate and implement their planning so as to promote as far as possible the wise use of wetlands in their territory. So this is oriented towards all wetlands in the territory of contracting parties. But the convention itself doesn't tell us what is meant by wise use, but there have been subsequent definitions since in resolutions of conferences of the parties, the most recent of which in 2005 says that wise use constitutes three elements. One, the maintenance of their ecological character, so ecosystems are being used wisely if their character is maintained, that this should be achieved through the implementation of ecosystem approaches. Ecosystem approaches is a concept that's been adopted and developed in international environmental conventions over the last couple of decades, that entails governing human activities not by species or component by component, but by reference to the impact on the ecosystem at large and trying to maintain ecosystem functionality. And that this should be done within the context of sustainable development, which in this definition is suggesting that the wise use of wetlands isn't necessarily an absolute bar on their use, but development is limited in that what has to be maintained above everything else is the ecological character of ecosystems. So our focal point is the ecological character of wetlands, and the resolutions of the party have further defined this for us, and the 2005 Conference of Parties defined this as a combination of ecosystem components, processes and benefits and services that characterise the wetlands at a given point in time. And that point in time is meant to be the point at which parties join the convention and are inventorising their wetlands and providing information, and then points at which guidance suggests that they should be updating that information. Our particular focal point from here on in will be the benefits and services of ecosystems, because consideration of that really requires reflection on the ecosystem as a whole, the functioning of the entire ecosystem, which makes the provision of those benefits and services possible. And that message is reinforced in the Convention on Biological Diversity and its definition of the ecosystem approach, which, remember, the definition of wise use tells us should be applied in maintaining the ecological character of ecosystems. And the Convention says that a principle of the ecosystem approach is conservation of ecosystem structure and functioning, that there should be a priority target of the ecosystem approach in order, it goes on to say, to maintain ecosystem services. So it's recognised there that to maintain the services provided by ecosystems, you need to be looking at maintaining the functionality of those systems at large. Now, a corollary of the wise use obligation is that an implicit obligation that state parties should be preventing unwise use. What do we understand by unwise use? Well, again, the 2005 Convention describes circumstances in which actually the wetlands that are designated under the Ramsar regime might be regarded as deteriorating, but I think we can equally apply this to wetlands in general, and it suggests that ecological character is not being maintained where there is human-induced alteration of any ecosystem component, process, or ecosystem beneficial service. So where human intervention is causing aspects of the ecosystem or the functioning of the ecosystem at large to deteriorate, then we are failing to maintain ecological character. So that is what national legal regime should be aiming to protect the ecological character of ecosystems. How can they contribute to this? Well, I think the key contribution they can make is the second of those points, which is also connected to the first, that is creating a wise use context for socio-economic activity. So creating a framework within which our activities as societies, our economies are operating that requires wise behaviour. That's the principal contribution that law could make, and this is recognised in Ramsar documents. In the conceptual framework for wise use, it says that without such a policy and legislative framework in place, there is a risk that other interventions will take place in a political vacuum without a clear authorising environment in their delivery. So having a good legal framework in place within which initiatives are being pursued is essential to provide a wise use structure. The law can perform many important functions within that. In addition to creating an overarching context, it can establish principles and rules of conduct for activities to try and ensure that they are performed wisely, establish how uses of resources is to be allowed and the extent to which they will be allowed before they're viewed as becoming unwise, designating and protecting sites, so identifying the most important wetlands, giving them legal protection, and incentivising wise use, so actually generally making it worth people's while in terms of taxation and other benefits to be protecting and improving the condition of wetlands. And this important role of law, recognised in the last strategic plan of the Ramsar Convention 2009 to 2015, fundamental requirement that parties should develop and implement policies, legislation, practices to ensure that the wise use provisions are being effectively applied. And the Convention also has guidelines dating back to 1999, but resolutions have been issued since requiring them to be observed for how the national legal frameworks and institutions might be reviewed and amended to achieve wise use. So law has an important contribution to make in implementing that wise use conservation obligation. But there are some challenges with our current legal approaches, particularly when it comes to the requirement, the principal requirement for wise use of maintaining ecological character. And that is that the legal approaches that we tend to employ currently are knowledge intensive. They demand knowledge and understanding of ecosystem behaviour to be able to function. With permitting decisions, we have environmental impact assessments feeding into them. They demand good environmental information for good environmental decisions to be made, for there to be knowledge and understanding of how activities will impact on ecosystem functionality. Similarly, with laws that are judging the acceptability of activities by reference to some ecological standard, carrying capacity, for those to function, you need to understand what the carrying capacity of ecosystems is and how activities are going to undermine them. Finally, with the precautionary principle, that principle that is meant to enable decision-making to function, where there is uncertainty as to the consequences of actions, that says that you should not plough on regardless simply because there isn't firm evidence on the table that harm will be caused. Even that principle, you need to have a certain level of knowledge to invoke it. There has to be an awareness of risk. This situation is problematic because when we're dealing with, at the ecosystem level, ecosystem functionality, that sort of information is very often not available, the information that is required for legal protections to operate. Particular challenges that we have with governing ecosystems in this way, often understanding of how ecosystems function, of how they behave, of when they are vulnerable, is quite poor. And that's particularly the case with the key concept of the resilience of ecosystems, something which is central to their ability to continue functioning, with many elements of ecosystems feeding into their resilience, and we do not know well, sometimes not at all, the level of resilience in ecosystems, or when they are vulnerable to losing that. We generally have fairly poor understanding of causal pathways of harm, because we're not talking about individual elements operating on individual components of ecosystem. We're talking about something operating on components of ecosystems whose effects then combine with all the other effects of activities and natural forces operating on ecosystems, resulting in completely unpredictable outcomes. Now, you might say with these factors, well, these are things that scientific endeavour can overcome, and it's absolutely vital that our ability to know and understand the ecosystem improves. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that we are off the hook for massive scientific effort, because another problem for these legal approaches is that ecosystems are dynamic. They tend to assume that they are static, you can make a once-in-time decision and that's okay. Well, you can't, because ecosystems in reality, they're constantly changing, they're evolving, they evolve naturally, but they're evolving in different ways because of human intervention. Aspects of that, we cannot know what future challenges ecosystems will confront. So if we say an activity is okay today on what we know, we don't necessarily, it might not be okay tomorrow, and we have a good reason to be concerned about that because of our own actions that have resulted in, that are causing climate change. You see, it's profoundly difficult, well, it's impossible to know all of the cumulative impacts that a particular activity may be combining with at a point in time, unless you are omniscient. And we should also bear in mind societal development. There's always the focus on the environmental behaviour, but what about our behaviour? What about societal development? Current legal approaches very much encourage a knife-edge approach, in which you're taking everything right up to the edge, what's perceived as the carrying capacity of ecosystems, but that's only looking at one side of the equation. That's deeply unwise when you think about the unknowability of future societal development. That also needs to be thought about in decision making. And we do time. So, this is the situation that I think we're in that presents particular difficulties to these legal approaches. That we are aware of, more painfully aware of one thing, that cumulative anthropogenic stressors affecting human activities are causing ecological degradation everywhere, rapidly at an accelerating rate. But we do not know a lot of the things that we would need to do to use our existing legal approaches to govern them. We don't know sufficiently well, as I said it there, where the cliff edge lies, whether ecosystems are particularly vulnerable to failure. We have difficulty with predicting the effects on ecosystem functionality of activities. We don't have the information that we need to know to be able to make those carefully balanced decisions on the effects of, on whether activities should be are appropriate from an ecological perspective, which is a bit of a headache because it undermines the basis for the knowledge-dependent legal approaches that we currently tend to be reliant on, and which policymakers, governments they won't really trouble themselves about environmental matters in policy making. They'll say, well, we'll just leave everything to the decision making when a particular project comes up or a plan comes up. But those levels, the legal approaches that are used at those levels are, I would say, not capable of I mean, very important, but not capable on their own of providing the sufficient protection for ecosystems. How should we respond to this? Well, in pieces that I've written, I advocate strongly something called a normative precautionary approach in designing laws. This entails that the uncertainty is not so that the precautionary principle that we have at the moment assumes that the uncertainty in decision making crops up from time to time. Whereas I would say that uncertainty is the medium within which all decision-making operates when it comes to ecological considerations, and all environmental decision-making is ultimately ecological. How would this normative precautionary approach work? Well, new approaches to governance that, given our uncertainty about how our activities are combining to undermine ecosystem functionality, we shouldn't be gambling with that. The government should actually be aiming to drive ecological, reduce ecological pressures as a matter of course, moving away from this cliff edge, which we can't see what it is because some heavy fog has descended, but we know it's there or thereabouts. And that this approach to governance would generally prefer the least environmentally consequential options available for achieving objectives. It would involve introducing legal frameworks for policy making. Such an approach, and we mentioned earlier the importance of law in creating a context, and that without that context there's a vacuum in decision making, and nowhere is there a bigger vacuum than at the policy making level, which is generally not subject to any legal scrutiny, but it sets the tone for everything that follows. If we're concerned about improving ecological protection, then that level of decision making needs to be subject to some more scrutiny. And beneath that, our planning and decision making frameworks need to be reformed in a way that are also employing this normative precautionary approach, stress reducing, preferring the least environmentally consequential options, and also denying recourse to some that are obviously destructive. How does this work at the policy level? Very broadly speaking, if there were to be a legal framework for policy making to be introduced, this would envisage have a statutory objective of stress reduction guiding decision making, And then when looking at options for advancing policy objectives, ecological criteria such as, importantly in a wetlands context, use of resources, the demand for resources that options place will be used to assess policy options, and then those options will be further considered by reference to two guiding principles, which are already quite commonly used in some legal contexts, particularly in Sweden, Swedish environmental law on chemicals, substitution, so preferring the least ecologically consequential options amongst those available, and sunsetting, ruling out reliance on options that present certain or high risks of ecological disturbance. And it's essential that those two are operating so that a substitution principle is having an escalator approach, like it's constantly encouraging a search for less environmentally harmful ways of achieving things. Obviously, at the pinnacle of that substitution approach, the options of simply not consuming resources where that can be avoided, or consuming them more efficiently. Once you've rationalised your options in this way, then I think a quite useful approach to use will be a backcasting approach in actually forming strategies for implementing policies. So instead of the forecasting approach that tends to be preferred at the moment, looking at the mess we're in and thinking that we can't move beyond it, backcasting tends to look at a desired goal where we would like to be, then works backwards, looks at what measures might be employed to get there, identifies and doing that what are the boundary conditions, what are the genuine obstacles to reaching that point, and what are the things that appear to be boundary conditions but might actually be negotiable over time. And as part of developing that strategy, obviously, measures for implementing policies would need to be identified in this process, those that promote preferred options and that restrict those identified for that they are beyond the pale in an ecologically sustainable world. Planning and decision making, so more tangible, looking at how actual land such as wetland areas and the basins within which they're situated will be dealt with. I mean, the ecological planning process that I've argued for, it actually has, it has a function in advancing those ecological policies by actually looking at resource availability in localities and regions, actually trying to identify what possibilities there are for promoting ecologically preferable options, perhaps dealing with some of the ecological problems that particular areas encounter. On a bottom-up basis, I'm very much arguing for a bottom-up form of governance in which localities, regions, the public living within them are fully engaged in developing plans for greater sustainability. Plans for regulating land and sea uses, such as wetland areas, I argue would need to be developed at the eco-regional level. I mean, I'm not that that's something that the Ramsar Convention already advocates in its guidelines. But again, it would be employing a similar sort of approach, a top-line approach, so trying to drive ecologically preferable land uses and reinforcing that by steering land use away from sites of importance to maintain the resilience of ecosystems. So wetlands will be a prime candidate there for being off limits for significant development. And the decision rules reinforcing that, so once you have your plans in place, rules governing development, they should not just be, as they are at the moment, procedural rules, throwing in environmental information into the pot, which decision makers can then consider and decide whether they're going to take it into, well, whether that may preclude them from making a decision, but having free rein. So actually, laws that actually require substantive consideration of environmental protection, achieving environmental objectives, imposing strategic constraints, I call it again vital to have those firm bottom lines so that you don't have a situation where development is, the economic and social goals of development are constantly trumping environmental concerns. Which brings us back to the Ramsar Convention, the full strategic plan, and I should say I was looking at this the other day while I was preparing for this, thinking I'll see what it has to say about law, and I was horrified. Being a lawyer, I don't think the word law features in it. There is no law, unless my computer search function is defective, there's no law, there's no legal law, so that maybe there's a conscious effort to steer away from law, and that may not concern everybody, but as a legal academic, I thought, oh, yeah. Where's the law here? But I think that laws are going to be vital for achieving some of the key goals of this plan. I mean, goal 1, addressing the drivers of wetland degradation and loss. The whole purpose of the legal approaches I've just described to you is to achieve that objective. Particularly the target for this goal, integration of wetland values in planning and decision making, that necessarily involves the review of legal frameworks. Goal 3, wisely using all wetlands. Target for that, integrated resource management of the scale of the basin. Again, this requires a review of frameworks for governing the use of, for governing activities that are impacting on wetlands. Goal 4, enhancing implementation, capacity building for implementation of the convention in general and the plan, developing appropriate legal frameworks, vital to that. So I would argue, and you might say that I would, but I firmly believe this, that it's really vital that appropriate national legal frameworks are developed to further push the wise use context. There's a renewed focus on getting those right legal frameworks in place, and also looking at the international cooperation requirements of the convention. That has an important role here, because states are meant to be collaborating on developing laws to protect ecosystems. The one thing they can do here is by developing those common legal principles, on the sort of legal frameworks that should be established for conserving wetland ecosystems. So not just reviewing their legal frameworks, but reviewing it with a sense of what would be desirable to enable wise use. So, some key conclusions, which I think we can broadly summarise as ecological character is a bit of a headache for current legal approaches. Therefore, they should be reviewed and reformed to equip them for effective ecological protection, and to do that requires the development of laws that are properly taking into account the profound uncertainties that we're confronted with when we're dealing with the ecological level, and that it's important in connection with that, but also in any event, that a focus on getting good legal frameworks in place should be part of the full strategic plan for the convention. So that's me. Thanks very much for listening. Sorry for keeping you from your lunch, but I don't think we'll be too much.